Welcome back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. I want to talk about one of my favorite jazz guitar albums of all time, and that is the incredible jazz guitar of Wes Montgomery. So what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about how this album came together, but also one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it is because Original Jazz Classics just put out their edition of this as well just a couple of weeks ago. So kind of wanted to do not a full shootout, but to give you a little bit of my thoughts, tell you a little bit about why I love this album so much. So before we dive in, as always, go ahead and hit like, hit subscribe, and of course you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at what_can_brown. All right, so again, why is this a timely video? Well, Craft Recordings decided to put out a brand new reissue of this in their Original Jazz Classics series. And this particular one has the same credentials as many of the others do in terms of Kevin Gray and sort of the cover construction and all these things. The key difference here, though, is that this is actually not sourced from the original master tape. It's sourced from a stereo tape copy. So my understanding is that the original tapes are not in great shape, so of course we wouldn't want them to use that as the source content for this. So instead they were able to find a tape copy. So to the extent that that's evident here, I'll try to address as we get into more of the sonics. But first, maybe just a little bit about the context for this album. So the material was recorded in early 1960. I think it was January, by Riverside Records, with Wes Montgomery joined by, well, who do we have? We have Tommy Flanagan, we have Percy Heath, and we have Albert Heath. So this was originally recorded at Reeves Studio, which was a common studio for Riverside Records to use, and the engineer was also a common engineer for Riverside Records to use, and that was Jack Higgins. So he did a lot of what I would say is early work for Riverside, because he didn't, I don't know to what extent he stuck around that long, but he did a bunch of the classic recordings for Riverside, including Brilliant Corners. He did that Jazz Contrasts album by Kenny Dorham. He did Gigi Grice and the Jazz Lab Quintet. He did Kenny Drew's early recordings. He did Ernie Henry's, right? So a lot of these early recordings are things that he had his hands on. So why is this album important? Among other reasons, really, this was Wes Montgomery's second recording as a standalone leader. But what I would say about that is that this is sort of his first is what I would call like a packaged musician, or sort of a produced musician. So to explain, the story behind this is that Cannonball Adderley happened to be in Indianapolis and heard Wes Montgomery perform. He was impressed, and so he got Orrin Keepnews involved, who was the head of Riverside Records, and I guess Orrin agreed to record him. Now, this wasn't, it's not like Cannonball discovered Wes for the first time. He was actually already recording with his brothers with a group called the Master Sounds. They put out some albums for, I want to say, Fantasy on the West Coast. So Montgomery did have some other recordings, just not under his name, and he was sort of, to some degree, buried, I think, in that in the Master Sounds group. So to some degree, Adderley, I guess, was maybe responsible for recognizing that Wes Montgomery had a little bit more of that sort of solo, standalone leader potential. And so within just really a couple of weeks, Wes Montgomery was at Reeves Studio in New York City recording for Riverside, not this particular album, but his first album, which was simply titled The Wes Montgomery Trio. And in that trio format, he actually was able to leverage the exact same trio format that he had in Indianapolis, which included Mel Rhine on organ, and then it was Paul Parker on drums, who I'm just not as familiar with. So that was his very first album for Riverside, was just preserving that trio that Cannonball was so impressed by. But within just 3 months, Wes Montgomery was back at Reeves Studio in New York with this very, sort of New York, or at the very least East Coast lineup that you see here: Tommy Flanagan, Percy Heath, and Albert Heath. These were seasoned guys, had experience already recording for Riverside, and probably people that Orrin Keepnews had a little bit more confidence in. And so this was kind of, again, in some ways, I think rebranding or repackaging that Wes Montgomery sound out of the trio format and into something like this that was just a little bit more hard bop and feel, and a little bit less of that, I'll call it sometimes sleepy West Coast thing. So always a topic of conversation is did we need a reissue, right? Has this been tackled before? There are a lot of different versions of this out there. And so I did kind of want to talk about this before we dig into the music, just really quick, because this album hasn't been terribly available. So there are some early reissues that are out there, but to the extent that there's modern reissues, it's kind of been limited. So to explain, there are some early reissues. So 1960 produced not only the original pressing but also a very early reissue. I want to say that there was another in 1962. The last of the sort of 60s and 70s really was in 1967. I think that was the last time there was I guess what I'll loosely call like a classic era sort of reissue was in 1967. I think that was around the time that Montgomery was recording for Verve and playing a little bit more popular music, and so maybe it makes sense for them to reissue it. And then they actually came up with a completely new cover and they retitled it "Vibratin'." So probably to try to sort of lean into the sort of the soul jazz thing that was happening then. But then nothing really, no other reissues really in the U.S. until 1982, and then I think it was 1987. So some of these earlier original jazz classics reissues, and then a series of reissues like 2011, 2015. I think the most recent in 2023. Again, in the US, all under the original Jazz Classics banner, but the source material is never really referenced directly, and I think that calls some things into question. It's also interesting that this has never been tackled, to my knowledge. Feel free to correct me if you know otherwise. By what I would call an audiophile label. So I don't think that Analog Productions or anyone like that ever tackled this recording, despite the fact that it I think is commonly known as really one of Wes Montgomery's best works. So it's kind of interesting to have such a classic album that maybe hasn't gotten some of the attention that it deserves. So I think this is part of the benefit when you have these sort of classic recordings being included in a series like this new version of original jazz classics, right? That Kraft's Recordings is tackling, because there's an expectation of quality, I think, versus it just being kind of a standalone release that maybe shows up randomly on Amazon or at a Barnes and Noble, and you kind of wonder, you're like, what is this? I don't know anything about it. You look at the year, and you're like, you don't really know. Sometimes when it's packaged in one of these series, and you know that the series is of quality, gives you just a little bit more confidence, I think, about what you're going to get. All right, so the recording and the music. This isn't the best recorded album that I've ever heard. I'll say that up front. For what it is, a stereo recording by Riverside Records in 1960, it isn't bad by any means, but it's also not a Rudy Van Gelder recording. And maybe for some people that's fine, right? I know there's a lot of people who don't like certain aspects of Rudy Van Gelder's, or maybe you think that recording guitar was not exactly his forte. But I do think it's worth noting that there are some things that aren't as great about the original recording. And fortunately, where it's lacking is actually not in Wes Montgomery's sound, nor is it really in prominent sort of solo voices. I think I can say that for both Percy Heath as well as Tommy Flanagan. When they are standalone soloists, they really do sound good. But where this kind of falls apart, I think, is in two places. So one is when the ensemble is playing together. I don't think it sounds particularly balanced, and that's more of like a maybe a nuanced or a sort of a minor criticism. The bigger criticism, I think, is the drums. Whether it's an ensemble or it's not ensemble, the drums don't sound, I think, as good as they should. They kind of sound distant. It sounds like there's some like room noise around them, and so I don't know if it was their placement in the studio, if it's the mic placement. It could have been both of those things. But it sounds to me like they were just positioned perhaps a little bit too far away from the mic. Now, I will say, listen, I'm no sound engineer, right? I've never done this before in my life, so who am I to say? And I don't have a full understanding of the nuances in balance when you have an amplified instrument like guitar alongside an acoustic, otherwise trio, right? So regardless of those challenges, what I can say is it doesn't sound as good as other albums that I've heard. And it doesn't sound as balanced, and the drums don't sound as good. So, I think that even as not as somebody who's not an expert, I think I can at least say that there's some things about this recording that perhaps could have been better. All right, so I know what you're thinking. Is he talking about the original Jazz Classics edition, and is maybe the issue that, right, as opposed to the issue being present on the original pressing? Well, because I do have an original stereo, I did give that a listen. Now, I do want to caveat this. My original stereo is in great shape, but it is on low quality vinyl. It is what I oftentimes term like recycled vinyl, or it looks like recycled vinyl in terms of there being a texture in the vinyl surface, which materializes as a hiss in the playback. Um, so even understanding that mine has that issue, and by the way, anybody out there with an original stereo with the blue banner as opposed to the white, because that's the original, be curious if this issue with the hiss is something common on other people's original stereo recordings, which maybe is one of the reasons why they did such a very soon after reissue in 1960 with the white banner. But I'm going to set that aside for a second. The reason why I bring this up is because the same issues that I had with the original Jazz Classics is present in the original stereo as well. And so obviously this makes me curious if maybe the mono sounds better, if maybe the balance is better in the mono. And again, the lacking component here is drums. And so it's something that with an original Jazz Classics edition, if there was a difference, you'd expect it to maybe be a little bit more prominent in the OJC because a lot of those editions are a little bit brighter, especially in the cymbals and hi-hat. And I will say that the OJC does sound overall better than the original. But still it's not to the extent that of what I would expect, I guess, like a well-balanced recording to be. Now I will say that the OJC has better bass, and I do think that Wes's tone sounds a little bit brighter and cleaner on this on the reissue. And so overall, regardless of some of these complaints, I think the OJC is definitely an improvement on the listening experience. All right, so getting maybe all of that out of the way, and digging into just a little bit of sort of commentary on the music, right? So the music on this album really is outstanding, and I want to highlight just a couple of my favorites. And funnily enough, they're probably quite intentionally the first couple of songs on the album because typically some of the best sort of the songs that they thought might do the best typically show up at the beginning. And so I guess the first one I want to bring up is called Aragon, which is a Sonny Rollins tune. He named it Aragon. I think it's, yeah, Aragon, because it's Nigeria backwards, I believe. Yeah. So classic Sonny Rollins tune, opens the album. It's taken at like a really quick pace, and I think it showcases Montgomery's technique just exceptionally well. It's just this like really driving, kind of energetic rendition that I think is probably one of my favorite tracks that Wes Montgomery has ever recorded, honestly. The second one here is titled D Natural Blues. And this one's kind of funny because if you listen to it, the opening sounds like Heartbreak Hotel, like just the opening. So, and obviously that's a song that was popularized by Elvis, I think in like the mid 50s, maybe 1956. Fortunately, it's only the very beginning of the song, I think, that nods to that. And the rest is just like a series of solos that are really stellar, especially the first one, which is played by Tommy Flanagan. It's short, but just like really well constructed, and I think it fits the vibe of the song very well. Montgomery then, I would say, takes control with his solos. He takes a number of choruses afterward, and at one point they sort of shift into this like double time kind of shuffle feel before handing it over to the bass. So I feel like I feel like this particular song, why I like it so much, is that it feels maybe the most like intimate for me, not in terms of it being a slow ballad, but because it highlights each musician and allows them to stand alone and kind of build and like build their solos as a, I don't know, an individual artist. I feel like the piece is not overbearing in terms of what it requires musicians to do, despite the fact that it's a blues. And so, yeah, I feel like it shows the character of each of the musicians really well. And then so if there's like one other track, I mean, I love the whole thing, right? But if there's one other track that I want to call out, it's actually the longest one, and it is it's called West Coast Blues. It's 7 minutes and 20 seconds. So again, longest track, and I feel like it's the most interesting in terms of its construction. So at the same time that it's West Coast blues, which implies blues progression, and it does kind of follow a blues pattern. It's taken in three, I think, as opposed to four or two, which is unusual. And I think that the phrasing that results kind of throws you off as the listener. And so it's just interesting to me because when Wes is playing, even if you can hear that sort of subtle blues chord progression in the back by piano or bass, Wes doesn't really stick to the blues progression overtly with his melody, so it adds just a lot of interest. Not to say that he's playing like he's indifferent to the chord progression. It's just that he's not playing what you would expect him to play, I think. And he plays mostly chords here too, which is just sort of a different sound than elsewhere on this album, where he focuses more on sort of single string runs. And I don't know. I really like the change of pace on West Coast Blues. So that's kind of the long and the short of it. I just kind of wanted to focus on just this one album today for this video, and it's something that I got in, gosh, maybe a week ago, and I've been slow to be able to listen to this backlog of stuff. But I was just super excited about this because, again, the issues that I mentioned with my original, and I was certainly happy that this was an improvement on the original, at least to my ears. And yet, does it maybe deliver on, call it the best of what original jazz classics renditions in this particular series sound like? It doesn't, but again, it's like, what can you do if the source material sounds a certain way because of how it was recorded? Then it is what it is. I mean, what we still know is that this is at least critically, a very sort of a classic album. Again, most people consider this one of Wes Montgomery's best. I consider it one of Wes Montgomery's best, and I'm a huge fan of him as a in terms of his body of work. I mean, I would say that my focus tends to be more of his Riverside years versus his Verve and sort of CTI or A&M years, just because I like the style that he played on his early recordings. But I mean, gosh, like his albums for Riverside in the early '60s are some of my favorite on the entire label. And so, of course, I had to be able to check this out. And overall, I am still happy with the purchase. It's just that I'm, you know, constructively dissatisfied with some of the results. So that's which I think has come across in some of my commentary. Um, so hopefully this is helpful for anybody who maybe hasn't picked this up, maybe considering it. It is a recommendation for me, just not like a super strong must go get it kind of thing. I would be curious if there's monos out there that maybe address some of the balance issues. So if you have a mono, really any mono, and you don't think that there's a problem with the drums kind of sounding distant, let me know, because it could make me sort of put extra priority on finding a mono edition, because I just haven't heard it in that format. So that's all for today. Thanks everyone, as always, for sticking with me, and I'll see you next time.